Good afternoon, and welcome to this very, very special commemoration of Yom HaShoah, which begins tonight. Yom HaShoah is a memorialization of the at least 6 million Jews who were killed in the last century by the Nazis and their enablers. As one of the most or the foremost historians of the Holocaust, Dr. Rafael Medoff has written more than 20 books on the Holocaust, American Jewish history, and Zionism. His first book, entitled The Deafening Silence, American Jewish Leaders and the Holocaust, was called by the Association of Jewish Libraries as, quote, a damning book that cannot be ignored, and an important contribution to the study of the Holocaust period. Dr. Medoff received his PhD from Yeshiva University in 1991, and he has essays and scholarly articles that have been published in multiple journals. He's taught history and Jewish history at Ohio State University, Purchase College, State University of New York, and elsewhere. Rafi has served on editorial boards of American Jewish History, Southern Jewish History, Shofar, and Menorah Review. He's been closely associated and a contributor to the Academic Council, the American Jewish Historical Society, for many years. And he has served on the Academic Council since 1995 and has authored installments of its chapters in American Jewish history. Rafi has also contributed to several Holocaust movies and television series. It is indeed a profound honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Rafi Medoff, who will talk about his new book, The Road to October 7th, Hamas, the Holocaust, and the Eternal War Against the Jews. Rafi, tell us first about your book.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to be with you. I appreciate the invitation to share some thoughts with you and your organization today, especially in view of all the good work that Emet does for Israel and the Jewish people. It's a particular honor to be with you again. The new book, which will, I should call it the upcoming book, it'll be published in time for the anniversary of the October attack. So it'll be coming out at the beginning of October. I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see a copy of the cover because it can be ordered in advance. The pre-orders are being accepted by the publisher, the Jewish Publication Society of America. That's jps.org. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the discussion of what to put on the cover of this book, because sometimes, as you know, a cover can reveal a great deal about the contents of a book. Shortly after October 7, and ever since then, the Holocaust has been mentioned in countless articles, newspaper articles and others, referring to the Hamas attack. But almost invariably what you find is that the references to the Holocaust are simply a matter of numerical calculation. The typical sentence that we read is something like, Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7, the single largest number of Jews killed in any one attack since the Holocaust. And of course, technically that's true, but as a historian, I know that the history of the Jewish people did not begin with the Holocaust. We Jews have long memories, and much of our faith and practice relate to historical memories. We've just concluded the holiday of Passover, which is built completely around our historical memories and documentation of the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt, their persecution, their liberation, the exodus from Egypt, and so on. So, with our long memories, we understand that Jewish history did not simply has not simply gone from the Holocaust to October 7th. And in studying Jewish history, what we find again and again is that the events that we witness on October 7 have their predecessors, their precedents, and not just going back to the Holocaust, but going back much further. Hundreds of years, arguably more than 1,000 years of pogroms, of mass killings, of crusades, in country after country. So in composing this book, and in considering the ways in which October 7th resembles what I call the eternal war against the Jews, a war that has been waged for so many centuries, the question was what to put on the cover. And the obvious choice, and as you can see, is a scene from October 7th. But there was also a discussion about whether or not to perhaps use maybe a split screen with October 7th and then put right next to it something from an earlier period. Because when you look at attacks, photographs of attacks, of the various attacks on 22 Israeli towns and kibbutzim on October 7th, you see these scenes of burned out houses, of bodies on the ground, of massive destruction, which are eerily similar to so many earlier attacks, those within modern history where we have photographs. So, for example, and really you could show almost any of these. So just here's an obvious example from Russia, 1881. We were just looking at buildings charred from the fires of Hamas attackers and other Palestinian Arab terrorists on October 7th. And here we see an extremely similar scene from Russia. This is what happens to be 1905. But you really don't need to do much in terms of identifying the scene to understand that, yes, this is an eternal war against the Jews. So whether it was Palestinian Arab jihadists on October 7th or more than 100 years earlier with pogromists in Czarist Russia, the parallels are inescapable. In my remarks today, I want to focus on three particular areas in which there are parallels and which I elaborate on in the course of the book, The Road to October 7th. One is, of course, what we might call the methodology, the mass burning of Jewish homes and buildings, the murders, the tortures, the sexual atrocities. Everything we've read about on October 7th finds its precedent decades earlier and sometimes centuries earlier. This scene from Russia in 1881, the reason I want to show it to you is not to bombard you with grisly images of all the horrors that we know about, but to point to similarity between this event, Russia, Czarist Russia, in the late 1800s, and this scene, which I'm about to show, 60 years later, different country, different perpetrators, same victims, of course, the Jews. Here now we're just going to Lithuania in 1941. And again, there are so many of these terrible images available that it's all too easy to find such scenes. Lithuania in 1941, this was a massacre by Lithuanians. Now, Lithuania was under German Nazi occupation, but as soon as anti-Semitic Lithuanian pogroms had the opportunity, they began slaughtering Jews in a public setting. The Germans, in this case, in this particular massacre, were standing there off to the side, in some cases taking pictures for their own amusement. But the Holocaust, we need to remember, was perpetrated first and foremost by the Germans, but their collaborators in every country they occupied were legion, as this one of many examples reminds us. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the book Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen. The book was important. It was published in 1996. The book was important because, I'll say it was especially important for two reasons. One had to do with the question of the nature of German anti-Semitism. In other words, why did it happen in Germany as opposed to anywhere else? But as you see, I'm building a case that it did happen everywhere else. Nonetheless, Professor Goldhagen made a very important contribution in analyzing the specifics of German anti-Semitism, and he came to the conclusion that it was what he called an eliminationist type of anti-Semitism that differed in its severity and its scope from the anti-Semitism that was typically found in other countries in Europe and elsewhere. What I argue in my book, The Road to October 7th, is that eliminationist anti-Semitism also is a term that should apply to the violence that Palestinian Arab terrorists have been waging against Jews in Israel and sometimes around the world for more than 100 years. So yes, it is an unusual type of anti-Semitism, and unusually lethal, but I would argue not unique to Germany. The second important way in which Hitler's Willing Executioners contributes to our understanding of the period is Professor Goldhagen's very close examination of the killing process. Again, I'm referring here, in this part of my remarks, to the question of methodology, the similarity between the methods used by Hamas and its allies and methods used by killers of Jews during the Holocaust and going back many centuries before that. The first phase of the Holocaust today we call the Holocaust by bullets. This is before the Germans had perfected the technique of mass gassing in death camps. More than 1 million, it's hard to estimate the number. A reasonable calculation probably would be 1.5 million. Jews in German-conquered Western Russia were massacred in 1941, 1942 by bullets. Many of those killings took place, as Professor Goldhagen shows, in very close-up encounters in which an executioner was within inches of his victim and shot the Jewish man or woman or child point blank, having time to look into the eyes of the victim. In many cases, escorting the victim a certain number of yards from one point to where the mass graves were, giving the executioner time to reflect on what he was doing. This was a very up close and personal way of committing murder. Not at all the same as the later mass gassings, which were very impersonal and therefore, in a sense, easier to commit. Now, very, very few of these German executioners had any qualms of conscience. And so whether they were seething with anti-Semitism or just, as Adolf Eichmann infamously said, following orders, nonetheless, they were comfortable carrying out these kinds of brutal killings. And that's exactly what we saw, of course, on October 7th. Nazi style, and I use that term advisedly. As a historian of the Holocaust, I don't just throw that around. But yes, October 7th, we saw Nazi-style torture and up-close murders of individual Israeli Jews by Palestinian Arab terrorists. And when they couldn't enter a house or drag the victims from the house, we often saw them throwing fire bombs into the homes, set the homes on fire so that the Jews would be driven out. Again, a specific type of horror that was very widespread during the Holocaust. It's the exact same way the Germans and their collaborators often tried to root Jews out of hiding places, whether in the Warsaw Ghetto or elsewhere. We've been speaking so far a good deal about the Holocaust and the parallels between October 7th and the Holocaust. I've shown you scenes from some of the pogroms in Czarist Russia, but it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that the eternal war against the Jews, as I call it, includes a very important century-long hurricane of anti-Jewish violence, specifically by Palestinian Arab terrorists. On October 7, 2023, they claimed the largest number of victims of any Arab terrorist attack. But that's simply a matter of the logistics on the ground that day. They have been trying to do the exact same thing against Israeli Jews, going all the way back to the early 1900s. Among the most infamous of those earlier, let's call them Palestinian, earlier Palestinian Arab versions of their war against the Jews was, of course, the massacre in Hebron in 1929. The scene I'm showing you here is not yet another scene of dead bodies. We've seen enough of those, but I want to point out a very important aspect of this and other Palestinian Arab terrorism against Jews, and that is the ideology behind it. I said before that I'm going to be focusing on three areas of commonality between October 7th and its predecessors. Methodology was the first. Now I'm moving into ideology, the similarity between the ideology of killers of Jews, whether on October 7th or going back many centuries. Now, at first glance, one might think, well, how can they have similar ideologies? These are people of different religious backgrounds, whether it was crusaders in medieval times who were Christians, or the attackers in Hebron in 1929 who were Muslims, or the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s who had their own religion of Nazism. And yet there is a very important ideological link between these and others. The scene from Hebron in 1929 that we're looking at now is an attack on a synagogue known as the Avraham Avinu Synagogue, part of the centuries-old Jewish community in Hebron. At this point, in 1929, it was, of course, part of the British Mandated Palestine. To me, the interesting thing about this scene is that the attackers were not simply content to slaughter Jews. They did, of course, massacre, torture, and sexually abuse hundreds of Jews in Hebron that day, killed 67, left many others grievously wounded, some crippled for life. But we see here that they felt it necessary to rampage through the most prominent synagogue in the city, to destroy the Torah scrolls, to hurl prayer books about, and to desecrate it as much as possible, because from their point of view, the Muslim, Palestinian Arab Muslim war against the Jews is very much an ideological struggle. It is not simply a matter of how many Jews they can kill, which is their foremost aim, but the ideological element is a religious perspective in which they wrap their acts of violence. So attacking a synagogue is very much a part of their jihad, or their contribution to the war against the Jews. Now that was 1929. Let me share with you a much more recent scene from another Palestinian Arab attack, and we will see immediately the ideological parallels that are so important to understand, and which really undergird the entire Arab war against the Jews. This is a scene from the year 2000. So we've just fast forwarded 8 decades. We have a photo from captured by a photographer for the Washington Post. It was on Rosh Hashanah. So they picked a sacred Jewish holiday, no coincidence, and they ravaged a Jewish holy site, a religious site in the city of Nablus, which Israelis call Shechem, the tomb of Joseph, of the biblical patriarch Joseph. Notice what they are doing here. They are not focusing their violence on trying to find Jews, Israelis to attack, but they have taken out time from their vicious assault on this Jewish religious site to specifically stomp on and beat with clubs Jewish religious symbols. This on the ground is what we call a mizrach, which is a large poster, a large poster with religious inscriptions with God's name in Hebrew. You can see it there right near the foot of that terrorist who's stomping on it. This is very much an ideological statement that their war against the Jews is also a war against Judaism and is ultimately rooted in ideology, which I'm going to speak about more momentarily. Those who have studied Jewish history going back further than the 20th century know that ideological based anti-Jewish violence reaches back many, many centuries. Among the most fascinating aspects, again, of the continuity between past and present anti-Semitism, among the most fascinating aspects is how killers of Jews throughout history have always taken time to publicize, praise, and in various ways honor the killers of Jews. I'm going to show you now a couple of images of monuments that were erected in medieval times for the purpose of inciting hatred against Jews and glorifying anti-Semitism. Some of these monuments still exist, even though they go back so many centuries, and you would think in modern Europe, which I'm turning to now, you think in modern Europe they would have eliminated all of these, but in fact there are still anti-Jewish carvings and monuments in various places in Europe. This one is from Germany, goes back to the Middle Ages. It's a well-known anti-Semitic image known as the Judensau, in which Jews are shown interacting with a large pig in various obscene ways. The point of such horrible anti-Jewish propaganda is that whether we're looking at events in the 14th century or 700 years later, we still see again and again the same kinds of public glorification of anti-Semitism and of anti-Semites. I want to share with you a photo of a monument still standing in Germany. I don't imagine too many people in modern Germany know what this represents. That's not the point. The point is at the time that it was created, in the 1330s, it was to glorify and honor a pogrom leader named Arnold von Usigheim, one of the most notorious mass killers of Jews during that era. And his followers and his many sympathizers were so impressed by the scope of his anti-Jewish atrocities that they built this rather large monument which still stands to this day. The phenomenon of publicly honoring killers of Jews, of course, did not end in medieval times. I'm going to now take us to an image of a much more modern, much more contemporary example, one of many, of the glorification of killers of Jews in Palestinian Arab society. So now we move to the city of Ramallah, capital of the Palestinian Authority. And courtesy of the organization Palestinian Media Watch, we see a photograph of a street sign being hoisted to honor Dalal Mughrabi, one of the most notorious Palestinian Arab terrorists in history. Notice the date under the Arabic writing. It's not the date of her birth, rather it's an important occasion on the Palestinian Authority's national calendar, the 11th of March, 1978, because at that time, what happened on 11th of March, 1978 was in fact the most horrific killing of Jews, the largest killing of Jews, again, since the Holocaust, that phrase. But in 1978, it was referring to an attack which took place on Israel's coast. The young woman after whom the street was named, who you just saw her picture on the street sign, Dalal Mughrabi, was the leader of a group of 11 Palestinian Arab terrorists who came ashore in northern Israel, where by unfortunate chance they encountered an American Jewish nature photographer named Gail Rubin, who was out on the beachfront taking pictures of rare birds. Incidentally, she happened to be the niece of a U.S. Senator, Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut. Dalal Mughrabi shot her point blank in a scene very reminiscent of the kinds of executions that we were talking about earlier and are described in Daniel Goldhagen's book. Shot her point blank, left her dead body on the beach, and then went to the nearby coastal road, the road that runs north-south along Israel's coast. They hijacked a bus. Here we see the aftermath of Dalal Mughrabi and her colleagues torturing, executing passengers on the bus, setting the bus on fire. 9 of the 11 terrorists were killed. One of the 2 survivors at his trial smiled as witnesses described the horrors of this attack. One of the witnesses, incidentally, mentioned that at one point Dalal Mughrabi, the young woman leader of this gang, grabbed a Jewish child and threw the child into the flaming part of the bus. Again, a scene which so similar to so many accounts of the Holocaust, so many memoirs of the Holocaust. And yet Dalal Mughrabi today is a hero in Palestinian Authority governed territories. There are 6 different schools, maybe more by now, named after Dalal Mughrabi. There are celebrations on March 11th, a day of mourning for Israelis, for the 37 Israeli Jews who were massacred that day, including the aforementioned Gail Rubin. 36 Israelis, 1 American. There are national celebrations. There are programs on PA television and PA radio celebrating the attack and heaping praise on Dalal Mughrabi as a national hero. In those schools that are named after Dalal Mughrabi and in all PA schools, children learn from their textbooks that Mughrabi is someone whom they should admire and emulate. There are speeches given by Palestinian Arab leaders on that occasion and any other occasion where it's opportune, where they speak of Mughrabi as a star, a heroine, a martyr, of course, and as someone who is the greatest example of a Palestinian Arab hero. The question, which I deal with at some length in my book, The Road to October 7th, the question of how do people get to this point? How is it that that in medieval times in Europe they massacred Jews, and in the 1920s in Hebron they massacred Jews, and in 1978 they burned Jews alive in a bus on the Tel Aviv coastal road? What's the common bond between these 3? And it is my contention that in all 3 cases, a combination of a religious and nationalist ideology is the key. Now, obviously, there are different flavors, but ultimately, there's a lot in common between, first of all, the ideology that motivated the medieval massacres of the Crusades and of other occasions. Invariably, those massacres were based on religious ideology. In that case, an attempt to punish the Jews for not accepting Christianity. Children were educated with the belief that Jews were guilty of killing Jesus, collectively guilty for all time, and therefore deserved to have violence done to them. That was the common denominator for children growing up in the Middle Ages. And some of those children then, as teenagers and adults, then put that ideology into practice through the use of the weapons they had at their time and committed horrific massacres in community after community. For Palestinian Arabs, whether in the early 1900s, prior to the Hebron pogrom, or in the century since then, they likewise have been raised on a diet of hatred of Jews, not merely of Israel or Zionism, but of Jews and of Judaism, and therefore likewise have been taught since a young age that Jews are evil, that Jews are a danger, and that Jews deserve to be killed, and that those who kill Jews, like Dalal Mughrabi, are the role models for Palestinian Arab society. In that sense, very, very little has changed throughout the entire more than 100 years of the Palestinian Arab war against the Jews. The terrorists who carried out the October 7th massacres, tortures, and sexual atrocities, they were all educated in Palestinian Arab schools. They all watched on TV as Dalal Mughrabi and other terrorists were presented as heroes. They were taught by their teachers that the highest goal in life is to be a martyr, that is to die while killing Jews. So if raised in a Palestinian Authority school or Hamas school and taught that, inevitably some will then engage in that kind of violence. And to bring it full circle, pogromists in Czarist Russia in the 1800s or early 1900s were raised on a diet of extreme Christian hatred of Jews, similar to the pogromists in Germany 500 years earlier, essentially the same ideological view, resulting in the same horrific consequences. And of course, during the Holocaust, the Nazis introduced their own particular brand of hate education, in which all German schools were compelled to teach a curriculum of anti-Semitism, of glorification of violence, and of the need to eliminate the Jews. The Hitler Youth Movement and the parallel movements for girls in Germany were essentially a breeding grounds for the war criminals who 10 years later carried out the massacres of millions of Jews in German-occupied Europe. So again, we see the common thread running back all the way from the early medieval period through Tsarist Russia, through the period of the mass pogroms in Ukraine and shortly after World War I, to the Nazi period, sometimes in parallel with the Palestinian Arab war against the Jews. Let's look briefly at a couple of samples of the kind of propaganda. I'm calling it propaganda. For them, this is staples of education in the different societies to which we've been referring. Let's start with this rather well-known image. This happens to be from France in the 1930s, but it's an image of the Jewish menace that was very common in Nazi propaganda throughout Europe during this period. Now, keep this image in mind of the Jew as an insect, a menacing, dangerous insect that is threatening the world. Keep that in mind as I show you a second, much more recent. Let me start with this. A second image from Nazi Germany itself. Let's look at one more from this period. In this case, again, we see this, the image of the Jew as an insect, here again as a spider, trapping innocent Germans in its web. But this dehumanizing approach is very deliberate. once Jews are portrayed as dangerous insects, then the rationale to kill them is clear and I'd say almost overwhelming. Now let's bring it up 70, 80 years. And sadly, we see again how little has changed, even in a different country, a different language, a different religion, and yet ultimately an ideology that is painfully, horribly all too similar. Now we're in the 1990s. We're looking at an image from the official Palestinian Authority newspaper, Al Hayat Al Jadida, in which Jews are portrayed again, insects. Here they're worms eating away at peace. It's really the exact same image. It's the idea that the Jews are less than human and they endanger everyone, whether it's endangering what's here is called peace, or a moment ago we saw them sort of endangering passersby or endangering the entire world. It's the very same image of hate on which children have been raised in different societies and yet therefore producing such similar results. That happened to be from 1998. Again, there's so many such images that it's easy to find ones that are representative. Let me show you one even more recent. Last year, again, official Palestinian Authority news media. Here it's the Jew as a scorpion. Same basic concept. Notice how the scorpion's front claws look like bulldozer arms. So here you have the Palestinian Authority sort of mixing together the idea that the Jews are settlers, the Jews are occupiers, but ultimately it's the Jews are less than human and are a menace that must be eliminated. This is in 2024. This is after October 7th. One of many examples of the Palestinian Authority showing its ideological solidarity with Hamas and with the other major perpetrators of the October 7th massacres. One more set of images, and this has to do with one of the most famous anti-Semitic texts of modern history, and that's, of course, the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which has been around now for well more than a century, but remarkably, again and again, it shows up in different countries, different languages. Here we have a version, this is a cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, edition from France in the 1930s. A tract used to teach people and to incite, I should say, to incite the public to hate and kill Jews. And we can fast forward to now to any Arab country, really in any decade of the past century, and find that it is equally popular and equally deadly in other language. Here I'm going to show you one which was in, this is a Syrian edition. So you have a different type of dehumanization. Here we have a snake, but the same text is popular and for the same reason, because it is a staple of a hatred and an incitement to violence which does not change, whether it's a different country or a different ideology. In the last few minutes that I have to share with you today, I want to address third area of commonality between past and present, between the past and October 7, 2023, which I go into in considerable detail in the book. And that is the question of international responses to October 7th and international responses to the persecution of Jews in the past. This is, of course, a very broad topic, but I want to mention two specific examples because we have seen horrific scenes of support for Hamas atrocities on major American college campuses during these past 2 years, and it is not ending. The subject of how universities in our country have responded to October 7th strikes me as having an important parallel to the way a number of major American universities responded to Nazis on their own campuses in the 1930s. And here I want to briefly acknowledge my late colleague, Professor Stephen Norwood, whose book, The Third Reich in the Ivory Tower, is still very much worth reading. It is the pioneering exploration of how American universities responded to Nazis and Nazism in the 1930s. Professor Norwood focused on Harvard and Columbia and how they invited Nazi representatives to speak on campus, how they took part in student exchanges with Nazi-controlled German universities in the 1930s, and other steps that those universities took then to establish friendly relations with Nazi Germany. But I want to briefly mention two universities that I have been looking at in a sort of an extension of Professor Norwood's research. George Washington University and Wesleyan University. I want to explain briefly why I've been very recently writing and researching about these two schools in the 1930s. At George Washington University some months ago, one of the many pro-Hamas protesters was photographed holding up a sign that said, "Final Solution." This particular protester was never interviewed, so we can't be sure whether this person's point was that they were accusing Israel of committing a final solution of genocide, or whether they were saying Israel deserves a final solution, deserves to be wiped out. But really, it's probably a little bit of both, since that ultimately was the central message of all of the university rallies since October 7th, that the Jews are committing genocide and the Jewish state should be completely destroyed, October 7th style. That sign made me wonder how George Washington University responded in the 1930s. And so I went back and I studied the campus newspaper, it's called The Hatchet, for the entire period from 1933 through 1945. And what I found was that Nazi diplomats, George Washington University is of course based in Washington, D.C. So Nazi diplomats who were nearby repeatedly were invited to campus, were given a friendly reception. George Washington students were sent to spend a year in Germany, in Nazi Germany at their universities, and students from those universities who were really propaganda ambassadors were at George Washington. There were numerous ads placed in the Hatchet throughout the 30s by the German government. Nazi Germany placed ads in the papers to encourage student tourism of Nazi Germany. All this went on the George Washington campus without the slightest protest or opposition or regret from either the university's administration or from students on campus or the student newspaper. Now, I would say that the connection between that and the contemporary period is roughly like this. When faced, in the last 2 years, when George Washington University administrators were faced with students on campus calling for the mass murder of Jews, they tolerated them. Only extreme and rare cases did they penalize any of them. Generally speaking, they tolerated them. They allowed them to call for the genocide, to cheer the genocide of Jews. So the instinct of the university administrators was to bow to the mob, to bow to totalitarian sentiment, and to worry more about the feelings of the Hamas supporters than their own Jewish students and faculty. And therefore, the parallel to the 1930s is that, although it's a different administration, of course, when confronted with those who were persecuting Jews and supporting the persecution of Jews in those days, they welcomed them on campus. They took part they had participated in relationships, friendly relationships with those Nazi universities, and they were completely comfortable with such people. My research on Wesleyan University in Connecticut is much more recent. Many of you just 10 days ago saw an op-ed in the New York Times, coincidentally appearing right on one of the days of the Passover holiday, from the president of Wesleyan University, criticizing our current president's crackdown on anti-Semitism on various university campuses. And the president of Wesleyan is outraged that the federal government is now trying to do something to counteract anti-Semitism on campuses like his. And that, again, made me curious. I wonder how Wesleyan, how Wesleyan responded to Nazis or Nazism in the 1930s. Even though their university in Connecticut, not right near the German embassy in Washington, as George Washington University is, even though they are rather farther away, I found that the Wesleyan administration also, on one occasion, invited a Nazi diplomat to come speak on campus and gave him a warm reception. Wesleyan also engaged in friendly student exchanges where pro-Nazi German students came to Wesleyan and they gave pro-Nazi speeches on campus. Nobody interfered, nobody protested. The administration never severed this student exchange program. One of the visiting Nazi students, by the way, was the nephew of Rudolf Hess, the Hitler confidant, the number 3 man in Nazi Germany. His nephew was giving pro-Nazi speeches on the campus of Wesleyan in the 1930s, and the administration did not do a thing. And also, the Wesleyan newspaper, the Argus, also carried ads from the German government encouraging Wesleyan students to visit Nazi Germany. So shockingly and disturbingly similar to what I found in my research on George Washington. Anyone interested in seeing my recent articles on these subjects can simply Google my name and Wesleyan or Google my name and George Washington. You can see the articles I've written recently. I just want to add before concluding that in both cases I contacted the presidents and other senior officers of both universities before publishing the research and asked them for their comments and whether they would consider issuing a statement expressing regret that their predecessors were so friendly to Nazi Germany. And in both cases, I have to date received no responses, which I suppose is rather telling. With that, I want to again thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Emmet for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'd welcome any questions from your audience.
We have many, many questions. I hope I will get to all of them. One of them was rather detailed and comparing, and this is a difficult one, Rafi, comparing and contrasting the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza to the treatment of Jews in concentration camps. And this was our first question. He went to great lengths to talk about the similarities of the way Palestinians in Gaza are in an open air prison, et cetera, et cetera. Can you discuss that a bit?
The phenomenon of comparing Israel to the Nazis and Palestinian Arabs to the Jewish victims did not begin with October 7th. Of course, we've been hearing it a great deal in this past year and a half. But those who have been observing the Arab-Israeli conflict since its earliest days know that this is a staple of Palestinian Arab propaganda to try to invert history and portray the Jews as Nazis. On the face of it, of course, the parallels are absurd. There are no parallels. The comparisons are absurd and baseless. But it is interesting how propagandists for the Palestinian Arab cause frequently are not content to argue on the basis of the actual facts, but rather have to turn facts and history upside down in order to try to score points. This phrase, Gaza's a prison, which again we heard for years before the attack of 2023, is obviously silly because, just to cite one of many reasons, up until the eve of the October 7th attack, approximately 15,000 Gaza residents left Gaza every day to go into Israel to work. And they also could have emigrated if they chose. And by the way, thousands have emigrated every year. I've never heard of a prison where a significant part of the population leaves when they want to. One of the least publicized aspects of the entire Gaza war has been the fact that emigration from Gaza has been continuing even throughout this last year and a half. And the final thing I'll say about how obviously absurd these comparisons are is that I suppose it's the only genocide, quote unquote, genocide in history where 99% of the population has survived the genocide. And normally, when we use the word genocide, we're talking about the definition is the deliberate, the intentional mass murder of people on the basis of their race, religion, or ethnicity. And yet, here we have 99% of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza. The residents of Gaza are still there. So that would make Israel either the most incompetent practitioner of genocide since the term was invented, or it means simply that, of course, Israel never intended to carry out genocide. If it had, it could have done it long before October 7th. But remember, Israel chose instead to leave Gaza in 2005,
2005.
18 years before October 7th. So for 18 years, the so-called open-air prison, in fact, was a de facto state, an independent Palestinian state. So to ask the question of genocide is to answer it, really.
Okay. Some of the other questions have been, well, this guy has, all right. Of course, you mentioned Palestinian Arabs before 1964, of course. 1964 was when the term Palestinian was first coined, and 3 years, of course, prior to the 1967 war. So we have to understand that this has nothing to do with liberating Judea and Samaria, but this has to do with liberation of all of Israel. So that's an important point, but I guess right now it's part of the lingua franca to call them Palestinian Arabs, even prior to that. Right.
Well, I would just add to that that the Palestinian Arab advocates on America's college campuses and in America's streets do not try to hide their intentions. They do not chant for a state in this or that territory. Their chosen slogan is from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free. And the only thing between the river, the Jordan, and the sea, the Mediterranean, is, of course, the only state is Israel. So I appreciate the fact that they are frank about their intentions. They are not they're not playing the game that Arafat played briefly, where he pretended that he did not want to conquer all of Israel, but just wanted a small state. They are very open and unabashed about their goal. And I think there's no reason to pretend that they mean anything other than what they say.
Right. So you have researched that George Washington University and Wesleyan University had opened up the doors to Nazi high-ranking officials and had exchange programs with the Third Reich. How widespread was this? We know this happened at Columbia. We know this happened at Harvard. Do you think this is endemic to all universities throughout the country during the 1930s and 40s?
I would not say all. We do know that a number of major universities pursued friendly relations with Nazi Germany in the 30s. This is an area of ongoing research. Professor David Wyman, the late author of the bestseller The Abandonment of the Jews, and after whom my institute is named, the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies. Professor David Wyman always said that although his book, that his book was not the final word on the subject. He studied President Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust, but he paved the way for the next generation of scholars to look at other related areas, one of which is the question of how America's universities responded to Nazism in the 1930s. I mentioned Professor Stephen Norwood, who began study in this field, and some of us, others, have carried on that research. But it's a work in progress. There are many other schools whose responses to Nazism should be examined. Those that were the closest physically to Washington, D.C., were the ones more likely to have Nazis come to campus, but not all. For example, we've been mentioning Columbia and Harvard, both of whom welcome Nazi representatives. Now, in the case of Columbia, they were in New York City, where the Germans had a consulate. Harvard had a very famous a graduate by the name of Putzi Hemstengel, who he had studied. He was a German who had studied at Harvard decades earlier, and then he came back for his 25th class reunion in 1934 when he was Hitler's foreign press spokesman. So Hemstengel was a senior Nazi official, and he was welcomed to campus as a kind of a hero because he was a big celebrity in 1934. Some Jewish students protested, but the university was very warm in welcoming him. So was the student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. And there are other examples like this. But so even some of those which were not near Washington also welcomed Nazis. I suspect that as the research in this field continues, more such skeletons will be discovered in the closets of many of our elite institutions.
You mentioned that some Jewish students protested. Was there any pushback at all from Jewish students or from their parents when these Nazi officials came that you could read about, that you know about?
Not much at Harvard. There were some protests at Columbia, not only by Jews. There were a number of rallies at Columbia. Some hundreds of students took part. There was also a rally outside the private residence, the mansion of Columbia's president, Butler, who responded by expelling the leader of the protest, Robert Burke, from the university. He was never readmitted. And by the way, here we are now, 90 years later, and Columbia still has not expressed a single word of regret for expelling a student who engaged in a peaceful protest, unlike the protesters at Columbia today, who incite violence, who harass Jewish students, who call for mass murder of Jews, who cheer the sexual atrocities of October 7th. Unlike them, these students at Columbia in 1933 and 1936 staged peaceful protests, and their leader was summarily expelled from the university. An interesting contrast between then and now.
Right. And as we know, yesterday, Harvard pushed back against the Trump administration in terms of the withholding of grants to Harvard, saying that this is an assault on their constitutional liberties, First Amendment rights. So we'll see how this is played out. And 200 universities signed on to this letter led by Harvard, fortunately. So we'll see how will be played out um, on college campuses throughout. Um, as it's time to wrap up, first of all, I want to thank you so much, Rafi, for your years and years of dedication and research. I think you are by far the paramount Holocaust scholar. Now that we've lost David Wyman, who you worked together with so closely, who wrote the phenomenal book, The Abandonment of the Jews. And, I also would like to encourage everybody to please get Rafi's book, The Road to October 7th, which is put out by the Jewish Publication Society. Please, October 7th and the Holocaust. The Road to October 7th, Hamas, the Holocaust, and the Eternal War Against the Jews. I wish we could leave on a more hopeful note. We do have a Jewish state. We do have members of the IDF, such as my son-in-law, who valiantly goes into the reserves, leaves his family, and I'm sure many relatives of yours, Rafi, and many people who are listening to this webcast in the United States. And I want to ask you all to please support the phenomenal work of Rafi Medoff. Really, I think the best Holocaust scholar that we have today. And to buy the book, The Road to October 7th. Please also remember to vote for slate number 19 in the World Zionist Congress elections, where I am part of the slate. And please support the wonderful work of Amit. Even this afternoon, we have two more meetings on Capitol Hill with members of Congress to make sure that the Jewish state will remain strong. And that is our way of fighting back. Thank you so much, Dr. Rafi Medoff.
Thank you.